Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, the first in a four-part series on attachment theory and its application in the family law context. I'm Nicole Smith, Acting Coordinator of LEAP's Family Law Forum. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm joining from Sydney on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Family lawyers are regularly called upon to navigate emotionally and psychologically complex disputes. At the heart of most parenting matters is a fundamental question: what does a child genuinely need to thrive? Attachment theory offers one of the most robust frameworks for answering that question. Yet for many practitioners, it is only encountered through expert reports rather than examined in depth. This series is an opportunity to change that. To guide us, we have two experts from the relation space. Paul Lodge is a Medicare accredited clinical social worker and family consultant with over 30 years' experience in child and family settings. He spent 21 years as a senior family consultant at the then Family Court of Australia and is a recipient of the court's Janet Kitcher Excellence in Performance Award. Dr. Heather Garn is a clinical psychologist with a PhD in psychology who prepares child impact and single expert reports. Her work is grounded in developmental psychology, attachment theory, and evidence-based assessment frameworks, with particular experience in high conflict matters, family violence, and culturally and linguistically diverse families. Today, Paul and Heather will provide a grounding in attachment theory before turning to one of the most contested areas in practice: parenting arrangements for infants and toddlers, including overnight stays. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll address them at the end of the session. This session will also be recorded and made available through LEAP's Family Law Forum. I'll now hand over to Paul to begin.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you to all those who have joined us today. We are two practitioners on a mission, and that is to really focus long and hard at the impact of caregiving arrangements on children under 3. I hope by the end of the slides you'll agree with me that they deserve special attention, and in some ways we all need to lift our game when we're thinking about subjects like overnights and attachment. Unwittingly, children seem to be in the midst of a rather major social change, and that is the transition from the tender years doctrine, where mums looked after babies, 60s, early 70s, and so on, and the issues that arise now were there because there wasn't such a thing. Equal time wasn't a notion. It's now a notion. It's here. It's with us. I'd love to ask some of the babies what they might think, but the under 3s can't, so we've got to think a little bit for them. I hope also to help a little bit with your practice in terms of how to target questions and understandings about overnights, and how to best to choose an expert. Those sorts of questions I think will be dear to you. A little bit about our process. We go now to the next slide, please. This is the whole program. It's hopefully a coherent program. The way we'll be operating is it's a bit heavy up front with theory to begin with, but I think you'll find that useful so that we've got something more of a shared language. And for the other seminars 2, 3, and 4 will make a great deal more sense. So you'll have to bear with me a little bit while we're a bit nerdy about attachment terms. They're all a bit clunky, but at least if we can share them, that would be useful, I feel, in terms of professional interactions. So what I'll be doing with each slide, as I just did, I'll say the next slide, please. And when we come to each slide, I'm going to give you a minute or less to read through what is written on the slide. So if you read that quietly, having been to many presentations where the presenter has read the stuff that's presented on the slides and then moved on, I'm acting on the assumption that you can all read it. And so once you've read it, I'll make some comments and some summary, and then we'll move off to the next slide. And I hope that's an efficient process for us. Heather I'll be the leader for the first two seminars, and Heather will be the commentator, and we'll reverse those roles for seminar 3 and seminar 4. I think that's about it. Heather, there's any more we need to say?
No, that's all good. Thanks, Paul.
We're all good. Okay, next slide, please. This is all purloined from the wonderful Susan Johnson's book, Attachment Theory in Practice. What the first slide, hopefully, no, so your minutes now to have a quick read through. Okay. The subtitle of this slide could well have been, what's the evolutionary purpose of falling in love? We are deeply, deeply connected species. We need to be for our survival. We spend an awful lot of our time and effort and emotions, as it says, from the cradle to the grave, using our early hardwired drive to fall in love, to become attached, to create an affectional bond with initially parents, and then siblings and friends and grandparents and so on. But there's a fundamental basic drive underpinning attachment, and that is simply to survive. So a lot of attachment theory is sort of hidden in plain sight. If something is quite obvious as feeling connected is a basic human need, along with food and sex, is something that is not as obvious as it might seem. We don't tend to talk about it in those terms. We're mostly aware of the need for a loved one, for a parent or similar. When we feel at risk, or we're challenged, or in pain, or our world is uncertain, we look to our close ones to help us through. Somebody who can be there with us. The basis of attachment theory is predictable physical or emotional connection. So what happens with an infant? They basically form connections in the first 3 years because they need a co-regulating attachment figure to calm the nervous system when they're upset or worried or ill. And we could keep on coming back to the term safe haven, loved one as safe haven. If that gets etched today, then we'll have partially achieved our goal. Next slide, please. I'm going to recourse to A.A. Milne to help describe some of this. Are you there for me is a critical phrase in attachment terms. And I'm mindful of when Piglet in Winnie the Pooh approaches Winnie and just touches her on the back. Winnie replies, what is it, Piglet? And Piglet says, just to be sure of you. That is what's meant by predictable patterns of attachment, just to be sure of you. And you can see in our context how that can readily get disrupted. If, by way of example, an infant has a very strong primary attachment, and that is disrupted by parenting arrangements, Piglet would probably be saying, "Where are you? Where have you gone? I feel lost. I feel rejected. I don't feel good about myself. I don't feel certain about my attachment world." Clearly, separation distress arises when an attachment bond is threatened. If, like me, back in the teenage days, you got dumped or rejected, the pain was searing. And some of the behaviors, certainly by me, weren't that pleasant, and I'm not about to describe them. But loss of attachment is a strong precipitator of distress and fight-flight behaviors to some degree. No more so than in the first 3 years of life, when infants can only really signal their needs through crying, cooing, and smiling, and other forms of behavior that will keep a parent close for survival purposes, comforting purposes. Moving out into the world is an interesting one, and I can describe that by, again, an example from my own life with my own kids when they were much younger. And that is, if you imagine a toddler in a park, and there's dad watching over while the toddler explores the equipment, moving out ever so slowly, the child will look back and make sure that their version of Winnie the Pooh is still available to them, still watching over them. Next slide, please. We're about to get even more clunky and a bit nerdy. A word that crops up over and over again. It was coined by John Bowlby, the founding father of attachment theory, and it's called internal working models. It sounds a bit like a Meccano set, and nowadays, if he was around now, he was around 50s, 60s, 70s, he probably would have chosen different words, but that's the one we've got. And it is quite a useful descriptor, in that what it's saying is that our early issues with attachment, whether our attachment behaviors are rejected, accepted, whether my need for calm is accepted nice and smoothly, it sets in me an expectation in my what's called procedural memory. That is the memory that bubbles under the surface, a bit like the memory you use for driving a car. It's a procedural one. You haven't got time to go, right, I'm about to put on the brake because I think there's something in front of me. It becomes automatic. I think there's probably a better term, but automatic memory is close enough. Emotional memory is also used quite often. And the reason it's a working model is how our cues and behavioral triggers, stress, were handled in the first 3 years, sets up an expectation as to that's how future behaviors, future loves will unfold. So you have two basic, we'll come to this in a little more detail. An internal working model can either be generally secure or generally insecure. So if we go to the next slide, I'll go into that in a little more detail. these are all based on what we'll come to subsequently, the gold standard test of attachment called the strange situation procedure. But arising out of that for now, a secure internal working model is basically when a child's cues for a need, say crying by way of example, is responded to with comfort rather than distraction, is when the parent just stays with the child until that child's system is calmed down, and then that child can go back to play or whatever the exploratory activity is. Anxious ambivalent internal working models arise when the caregiver is perceived by the infant to be inconsistent. That is, sometimes the calming is coherent and responsive and tender. Sometimes there's an overemphasis on distraction, or just simply saying, look, why don't you words like, I'm just going to leave you alone because you'll get over it. The behaviorists would say, by the way, that distraction is a good thing. It's certainly not a bad thing, and all parents would employ it. But an overemphasis on distraction is exactly, going back to Winnie the Pooh, is exactly what's going to leave Piglet or the child feeling that that I'm disconnected from my emotional needs. If you think as an adult, it's another way of thinking about it. When you're in distress, to be told to get over it, or you'll be better tomorrow, totally disconnects. The essence of attachment is a sense of connection with the attachment figure. The third category, avoidant internal working model, is basically when there's a pattern of ignoring behaviors on behalf of the parent. With the anxious attachment, the child is likely to amplify their behaviors because they're uncertain whether or not they're going to get a calming response. The avoidant model, the infant learns, well, there's not much point in me screaming and shouting and getting upset because it's not going to help me. I'm not going to get the help I need. And so I just get this internal working model of I got to look after myself, and later on in life, an expectation that that's what others ought to do. Disorganized it came along much later. It's utterly critical to understand in our context, because it is the major attachment consequence of abusive behaviors, of violence, witnessing violence, sudden shock, traumatic loss. So we will come to that in as part of this series, but in the strange situation test, the actually, I think if we could go to the next slide, I think we'll come to that. Bear with me. No, sorry, go backwards, Nicole. Yeah. The strange situation test, I'm going to address this now, and we'll skip the subsequent slide about it because it seems to fit better here. The strange situation test entails 7 3-minute episodes, about 20 episodes in all. The child's behaviors on separation and reunion are what is being critically watched from the 3 people who are involved: a stranger, a parent, and the child. The child is put through increasing levels of mild stress, that is the parent going from the room, being left alone with a stranger, and finally being left entirely alone, albeit for a short time. And I can assure you that if you think that's rather harsh, then it's a critical part of the strange situation test, that babies are not left in distress, obviously. So an anxious ambivalent pattern would be the child has enormous difficulty separation from a parent, and on reunion is likely to be very, very difficult to settle. Now, if you think about how often that happens to infants when they're returning from overnights, it's important to notice the parallel between this test and separation and reunions in the context of overnights. Avoidant children, actually in the test, they don't appear to notice when the parent is leaving, and they seem a little bit dismissive when the parent returns. It looks as though they're not too bothered, but when you put a heart monitor on children who are avoidant, internally, their stress system is still activated, their heart rate, their pulse, and so on. Could I turn especially to the bottom part, because I'm aware that sometimes attachment theory sounds quite alarming in the sense of the models that I'm talking about are enduring. They are, of course, enduring, but they are reversible by a long-term, stable, secure, predictable attachment relationship with one main caregiver, supported by, in our context, attachment-based therapies and interventions such as Circle of Security, which is the whole of the subject of the second of the seminars. Next, please, Nicole. As I said at the beginning, getting it right for under threes is particularly important. The reason being, their models, their internal models, if it goes badly wrong, if they're insecure, has long-lasting implications for development, for mental health, for emotional well-being, for the way we act in relationships. What happens at the beginning subsequently impacts on long-term mental health, well-being, etc. And you can see the problems coming for our system, where we have two homes. Parental availability can be compromised, obviously, and attunement can be challenged. I can't emphasize enough our parents and are under extreme stress, and it's very difficult to stay attuned to an upset crying infant while you're also trying to prepare your affidavit for the next day, or you're worried about being hurt, or you're feeling lonely and isolated. If I had to put in huge writing in big letters for all of us in the family law system, is there anything we can do to reduce the stress on attachment figures, particularly if there is a primary attachment figure? The parent's mental state is the key. The parent's mental state can be governed by their own early childhood experiences, by trauma, but in our system, predominantly by stress. So imprinting is a word associated with animal behavior. and it's basically following, I think, Heather, following the first thing that you see. Usually that's going to be mother duck or mother monkey, or uh, but also it's such a powerful process that Lorenz found that they followed him. And the cloth monkey test was basically baby monkeys, preferring a cloth monkey to a monkey that dispensed food. So powerful was the drive for attachment. So, Heather.
Yes. So with Lorenz's experiment, he did it on young geese, so newly hatched goslings, and he observed that the goslings would instinctively follow the first moving figure that they saw. And what this demonstrates to us is that young animals are biologically driven to stay close to a caregiver for safety and survival. So really relevant to, like the attachment on imprinting. And with Harry Harlow, he devised an experiment with baby monkeys where he provided in the cage two objects representing maternal figures, one of which is a soft cloth and another made of wire that dispenses food. And what he observed is that the baby monkey spent far more time with the soft cloth mother than the wire mother that provided food. And this suggests that, baby monkeys need comfort, security, and connection, and not just physical care.
Thanks, Heather. Much of the early research was triggered by Balby's observations of young children in various difficult attachment contexts. One of which was the children in hospital, because at that stage, 1950s, 1960s, a child was in hospital. Usually, if they were in hospital for a couple of weeks, they would see their parents once on a Sunday afternoon. The staff of the hospital in those days would say, "Oh, they're being good to these children. They're not protesting. They're not crying." But they were clearly being avoidant because there was nobody to respond to them. So those babies, noticeably, when they were first in hospital, were extremely distressed. The distress abated over a few days, and the child withdrew and was non-communicative. On the Sunday afternoon, when mum or dad arrived, and we've heard this before in our context on separations and reunions, but particularly on reunions, quite suddenly a child who has seemed to be quite calm and content erupts in distress. And that is what happened then. Distress, anger, um, and distress and anger being the main manifestations on the Sunday afternoon. And the reason that's important is it's got a parallel clearly with those situations for us. And I think you will have come across this a lot, where one parent, often the dad, is saying, "Well, the baby was fine with me, didn't kick up a fuss at all, went to sleep all right." So therefore, it must be the other parent's problem that the child is distressed and upset. What this hospital example teaches us is children they develop a bond that has a strong safe haven with the primary attachment figure. And on reunion with the attachment figure is when you'll get the manifestations of distress and anger mostly. And it's quite confounding in the family law system because it's perplexing. It doesn't seem right. And it raises issues then, critical issues in my view, about to what degree, if one can identify a primary attachment figure, to what degree do we protect that relationship in terms of stress on the primary attachment figure, in terms of the child's need for the attachment figure because that's the one they prefer to express their miserable stuff to, if you like. Okay, next slide, please. Well, now the bits in red, implications for parenting arrangements and overnights, is thank you for listening patiently to the theory clunky side of it, but I think it does help perform a platform for the rest of this seminar and indeed the other seminars. And Heather is going to comment as well, so I'll allow you to read this through. We're now beginning to hopefully integrate the theory and our practice. And of course, we're entering into controversial areas. What Bowlby and subsequent attachment researchers found was for a child to feel secure, they only need one available primary caregiver. And that's important. If you can, and we'll get to it later, if you can identify a primary caregiver, a primary attachment figure, that is all that the child needs. However, logic would suggest and evolution would suggest it's a very, very good idea to have to, on the child's hierarchy of attachment figures, which are usually 4 or 5 at most, to have a few others, parents, grandparents, so that remembering attachment is underpinned by an evolutionary survival need. If your main person is out of action for whatever reason, as of course happens, hospitalization and so on, the child will have a sufficient attachment to others for them to stand in. Okay. That could be the dad, of course, it could be a grandparent, it could be a sibling, but it makes a great deal of evolutionary sense. One of the huge dilemmas in this work with young children is the arguments about, I've done a sufficient caregiving, as much caregiving as the other parent, and therefore I'm equally attached. Now, we're going to come to questions about equal attachment later, but right now, just accept for the most part, there's a primary caregiver and a few, 4 or 5 of secondary attachment figures. The loss of a clear-cut primary attachment figure for the purposes of overnights can be traumatic for infants. Not necessarily so. If you have a strong enough attachment relationship with the other parent, then it would be wrong to describe any upset with the other parent as traumatic. But if there's a clear-cut primary attachment figure and not a sort of sufficient attachment to others, then it's trauma is a word used advisedly, as in traumatic loss. Now, are overnights helpful but not essential? Are they helpful? Of course they are. It's one of those caregiving activities that helps us bond with our children, changing nappies, putting to bed, singing lullabies, bathing, and so on. All at that lovely period. Well, often but not always lovely period when you're putting an infant to bed. But are they critical? I think not. And I think the body of attachment research would support that. Can you form an attachment to a child by seeing them? Of course you can, just in the daytime. You can. So I think, and it's a personal view, but I think it's an evidence-based one based on the main body of research, attachment research. Overnights are helpful, but not essential to attachment formation. a concern of mine is in order to facilitate a parenting arrangement where a child is not a long distance, a long time away from a main attachment figure. We have say, well, 1 or 2 nights. That would be enough to form an attachment with the other parent. But I think we know now, or I believe, that it can be very distressing, particularly remembering the strange situation test on separation and reunion. So the more transitions you have, the more you subject a child to stress 3, 4, 5 times a week or more. And what we know about stress is that stress becomes a hardwired system. That if you subject a child to stress sufficiently, any form of stress in the very early years, you end up with subsequently with an older child or a teenager or an adult who has very strong stress reactions. His stress becomes hardwired, and we call that a low stress threshold. I think you might have some questions about that, but for now, we could go to the next slide. Heather, did you have anything you wanted to add to the previous one? Could we go back, please, Nicole? Just once. I forgot. Yep. Heather?
Yes. So yeah, I think that in terms of the early attachment research, sometimes in family law, we may inadvertently conflate attachment with involvement. And a parent can be highly involved and deeply important to a child while not necessarily being the child's primary attachment figure. So I think that's quite an important distinction for us to make. And it's not really a statement about, who is the better parent, but it's simply describing who the child most consistently turns to and can be soothed when distressed.
Yeah. Yeah, precisely put. Thank you, Heather. Next slide. I think I've said sufficient about stress eroding a parent's capacity to be sufficiently in tune with and therefore able to calmly co-regulate. It's very hard for parents in our context. But from the child's point of view, it raises a question: are you there for me? Am I worthy of love? That is, whilst, of course, one is empathic with the parent that's stressed, from the child's perspective, particularly infants, their experience is, are you with me? Are you there for me? That is, say you've just come back from, but I'd love to be, but if one was a fly on the wall when a parent is coming back for an infant after a day being cross-examined in the family court or preparing affidavits or rowing with your ex, it's very difficult to be fully there and fully engaged and fully connected, and remembering that a sense of connectivity is critical to a child's emotional well-being. And so if stress compromises a parent's emotional availability, it has a similar effect to a compromised physical availability. That is a sense in the child that I've been left alone. There's nobody near to help me. I have some needs. Then the problem arises of, am I worthy? And you can see how attachment issues, if the question of am I worthy is asked enough of an infant, it can translate to it can translate to depression and anxiety in later life. And so this is why I feel we're on a mission here to try and do a lot better than we sometimes do with infants. Can I just give a relocation example, which invites the question, wow, this is complicated. It's difficult. The example is there's two parents, both good enough parents, both kind, both in tune, but the parenting arrangement of equal time was set up in the second year, when in my view this child was nowhere near ready. And it was a fairly conventional system, like every couple of every 2 nights there was a changeover. From the point that the equal time arrangement was set up, this child who clearly had, she was very clear when you looked at the caregiving history that this child had a strong primary attachment to his mother. The mother, unfortunately, felt unsupported. She was lonely, and was able to say in my assessment that she found it she was finding it very, very difficult at times staying in tune when she felt so horrible herself. I mean, her experience of loneliness was palpable in terms of its physicality. She felt alone, but of course, relocation was, do I go back to where my family was? I won't go into details of places because it's not fair on the people, but it was a long way away. So the question arose, even in these two good parents, two in tune parents, even in that situation, does one protect the primary attachment relationship? If so, if you go that way, you allow the relocation. But of course, there's a terrible compromise, the incredible distress and sadness for the other parent whose meaningful involvement with their child tried with all the will in the world. It was very difficult to have an arrangement given the distances where the attachment would remain, where the dad's involvement would remain meaningful. Very sad, but it just points to how complicated this is. And I find, I must say, that that good old phrase, the child's best interest, really helps me in trying to unpack difficult situations like that. I'm sure we'll come back to it. Heather.
Yeah, I think that was a really good example, Paul, and really speaks to the complexity of, like attachment and the parenting arrangements. And I guess to add on to that, when we are considering, where the child lives or, who they live with, how often they spend overnights with the other parent, if any, it's important that we consider not only what is gained through each living arrangement, but also what may be lost in terms of attachment relationships, support networks, and continuity of care. And especially for infants and toddlers who are that young, that's going to be a huge disruption for them.
Okay, thanks, Heather. It's kind of affirming to hear you say that, because sometimes when you're talking about these sorts of issues, I feel like I'm going out on a limb. And so to hear others having similar views is helpful. All right, next slide, please, Nicole. Based on his observational research and subsequently endorsed by hundreds of studies since, it was noted that a child's attachment to a parent unfolds in a logical sequence in the first 3 years. Almost invariably, across cultures, and irrespective of sexual orientation, irrespective of gender. A child will form an attachment along these phases. The first, I thought it was longer than that, but this is what the books say. 0 to 8 weeks or so, a child's attachment behaviors are indiscriminate. That is, you could be at a party with your fairly newborn infant, say 4 or 5 weeks old. That infant you can pass around to everybody in the group, and provided he's comfortable or she's comfortable, you won't hear a whimper from them. However, attachment is being formed. So for our purposes, a really key question, particularly in and around when the separation happened, if it happens in the first 8 weeks or indeed up to the first 6 months, that is the most powerful time for getting to know you, as it were, between child and attachment figure. If there's big gaps, it interrupts the attachment in the making, the attachment formation processes. Around about 6 months and thereafter is the beginning of the formation of clear-cut attachments. So if you haven't had the first period, you're not going to have a clear-cut attachment. The implications for our arrangements are fairly evident. You'd look first off at the first 6 months. Has that been continuous? Has there been big gaps? And that will help you get to the point of knowing, well, there's likely to have been an attachment to one or both parents, but if there's been big gaps, it will have been interrupted and the attachment bond won't be there for the basic attachment purposes. After about a year, a child will have formed their attachment hierarchy pretty much. If that's the entry point for a parent who hasn't had much contact with the child previously, it's going to be very difficult, because one of the signs of a child reaching this stage 6 months and after is normal separation anxiety and normal stranger wariness. So if say, an extreme example, a parent hasn't had the earlier phase, then you're very likely to have a child behaving to a parent as if they're a stranger. That is, will get upset and distressed. And the separation from the main attachment figure will also have evidence of more stress than is normal. You often hear, and I think this is about right, if you took a purely developmental view, round about 3 years, or certainly in my practice, I think one needs to be really cautious up until that point. I think one can be a little less cautious for several reasons. Co-regulation becomes less important. Children be able to self-soothe a little more, not always, but more often able to do so. So if they go to another parent and they're upset, they will allow that they can soothe themselves a little better. Their language skills are better, so that they're not dependent so much on crying and kicking up a fuss. The child of 3, 4 maybe is able to signal verbally, I'm upset, and maybe be able to verbalize what they're upset about, and can be comforted verbally. Though, of course, as in the rest of our born days, they also respond well to a good cuddle. Okay. I think I've already covered this in the previous slide. But if I can just highlight some points. Understanding the nexus between continuity of caregiving and attachment formation. As Heather quite rightly said, the two things don't automatically go together, but you do need to develop familiarity. So in our context, if it can be demonstrated that a parent has had daily involvement in caregiving, regular, frequent, daily involvement in caregiving without too many interruptions, that will be a bit of a sign that an attachment is likely to have been formed. In particular, caregiving in the context of upset, of needing a safe haven. The question I ask of both parents is, what do you actually do when the child's upset? And it's interesting the range of responses that you get, but the sort of good enough attachment response is I stay with the child, I listen to them, I do my very best to work out what's going on. I can convey a sense that me and the child are in this together, trying to work a problem out. Above all, being with and staying with that child. Okay. I've said that overnights are not critical to attachment formation, but they're useful. Importantly, after about 3, the apex begins to flatten considerably, and children's attachments spread along a wider range of people. I don't think it's an accident that sort of a lot of preschool starts around about that age, because the child who's going to daycare, preschool, can form an attachment, can have, and Heather, you might be able to help me out with this, the notion of object permanency. It means the child can carry around a photograph in their head of their attachment figures as a form of comfort. That's a very sort of social worky take on it, and Heather might want to add to that. So, Heather.
Yes. Yeah, I think like Paul said as well, the developmental stages are so important for us to consider when it comes to implications. And because they change so rapidly in the first 3 years, their developmental needs evolve quickly. And so an arrangement that might be appropriate at 6 months might not be appropriate later on. And that's why, recommendations of not just what's important for the child now, but, what would the developmental progression of the parenting arrangements look like is really important as well. And I think, we have the theory in terms of how attachment might be for the first 3 years, but it's also really important to take into account the child's temperament as well, their familiarity with the caregiver, and how adults can manage these transitions. So, two children in the same kind of situation with different temperaments and sensitivity might require different needs.
Okay, thank you, Heather. Next slide, please. I've covered this earlier, so I won't go into too much detail about it, but I'll just give you a chance to read it because it is worth trying to get a handle on the strange situation test. We don't actually use it, by the way. I think it's important to emphasize that it requires an awful lot of time and training that is extremely expensive. And in my experience, not many experts have actually got specific training in the strange situation test. But in their observations, the extrapolation from the strange situation test is look hard at separations and reunions. You'll have, I'm sure, seen that we mostly observe children, particularly young children, in interaction with parents. By way of example, in my observations of infants and children, young children, I do a very modified version of the strange situation test by triggering the attachment system with low stress. That low stress being asking the parent to just step outside the room so the child is left with me as a stranger. And I can, if the child starts to kick up a fuss, A, I'll get the parent back in quickly, and B, it's starting to help me think, well, is this some sort of insecure attachment? I need to ask more questions about that in interview. Not everybody does it, and for the sake of for legal practitioners, I think you need to be asking us much more how we come to our conclusions, and ask questions about how did you go about getting a sense that this child is insecurely attached? On what do you base that? So. I've talked about secure, avoidant, anxious, and disorganized, and we'll get to that more in subsequent seminars. Really importantly, particularly in our system, is Mary Main identified a fourth category, disorganized attachment, and that, I mean, others thought about it beforehand, but she wrote a lot about it. There's an argument between Mary Main and Mary Ainsworth, indeed, that disorganized attachment. Mary Ainsworth said, well, it's not actually a strategy. And when I've observed that, when I did my own training in the strange situation test, it was alarming to see disorganized attachment in the flesh, as it were. That is, on reunion with the attachment figure, the child did things that don't make any sense whatsoever. Like crying a playtime makes a great deal of sense because you get the attention of the attachment figure. But oh, my computer's about to pack in. The child who bites themselves or slaps their face on reunion with a parent, you're going to be thinking, is this disorganized attachment? Is it a product of some sort of abuse? Okay. I should preface this by saying I think that these assessments are really complicated and they really need to be thought through. By way of example, I might say boldly the overriding consideration of each parent's capacity to regulate sensitively and the baby regulate sensitively. How does one find out how that happens? Because you're not there at home watching. You find out by questions mainly and by observation in terms of separation and reunion in my sort of version of the strange situation test. Supported by detailed reports of child-parent interactions upon separation and reunion. My attachment assessment will involve primarily questions about separation, reunion, and what happens in the middle of the night. And one has to be very, very patient. You have to get through the fog of the system. Like, you know, parents obviously and understandably are trying to put their best foot forward. But if you can get through the fog and get to, say, a child wakes up in the middle of the night, well, what did you do? And go into it very, very specifically. Where were you? What did you do then? Did you leave the room? How long did you stay? How long did it take for the child to settle down? Look out for not being with behaviors like, well, I thought if I left the room and left the child alone, he'll cry himself to sleep. There are proponents of that, as we know. I'm not one. Okay, I think children in the night getting distressed need a bit of comfort, and if that includes co-sleeping, I'd say so be it, because the cost of leaving a child feeling disconnected, the impact can be long-term and quite psychologically damaging. Very controversial that, as there are organizations set up to follow the behaviorist model, that is, let the child cry and they'll cry it out. I don't think it's such a good idea, but I'm sure we'll discuss that. Heather.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's why, with observations, they are so important in family reports, acknowledging that it is limited. We might be observing them for, 30 to 60 minutes at a particular time, but parents can often tell us what they do, but observing a parent and a child, especially when they transition between parents, if they have been seeing a parent, if they see the parent during the observation that they have not seen for a while, that gives us so much information, particularly with infants and toddlers who might not be able to express themselves verbally.
Thanks, Heather. Next, please. I think we've covered much of this previously, but the two things I'd like to emphasize, because they're controversial and difficult, is equal time risky for infants? Okay. Now, I say yes. Can it work in separated parents? Yes. So my definition of risk is not this absolute foolproof, but is there an elevated risk for a child's emotional well-being with overnights? I think the answer to that is yes, but not necessarily so. If you have two parents that are getting on well, living next to each other, continuity of attachment and caregiving can be demonstrated, and the child responds, and the child will use both as a safe haven, there's no problem with equal time. But that's not generally our population, I don't think. And so, yep, equal time is often, but not always, risky for infants. I'm mindful that when you have an infant and it's away from you overnight, for reasons that I think are buried deep in the human psyche, it tends to make parents anxious. It certainly did me, and I think most parents that I know would find that difficult when your child is away overnight. However, it's a reality for separated parents, and so we need to deal with it. Best way to deal with it is if the parents can non-defensively, non-critically share with each other a child's observations about a child's behavior and what they might mean and how to interpret them. If there's a strong sense of a primary attachment figure, are they flexible enough to return the child to the main caregiver if there is one? Again, I'm afraid to say not many parents in our galaxy communicate reflectively and spontaneously, but it's critical to overnights. So if parents come to me in my therapy practice, I can go through with them because if they come for therapy and rather than the court, or some sort of therapeutic mediation rather than the court, there's a chance that they might be being able to listen reflectively and listen to each other reflectively. In those circumstances, why not overnight? Because if you say to the parent, a parent will say to me, well, how do I know whether this is doing some sort of damage to my child? The key answer to that is not that they get upset. Babies get upset. It's how readily they can be calmed, and by whom is the key to it, to overnights in a way. So how quickly does the child settle? The example that I gave you earlier on, the relocation example, the child, like most children, when they're being soothed, we're talking minutes more often in most circumstances. When you get parents coming to you and saying, well, he was still upset the next day, and was a bit withdrawn the next day, or woke up in the middle of the night much more than usual, you got to think that separation anxiety is not normative. It's not unfolding normatively, because children mostly can be soothed quite quickly. So question that the expert needs to ask is, how quickly does the child settle upon separation? And it'll give you a whole heap of good information. In that particular example, the child regressed in terms of toileting, was having night terrors, all precipitated by, as far as I can see, the equal time arrangement. None of the other variables were there. The two parents were okay. The child could use both parents to some degree as a safe haven, but on reunion with the mother, was very, very unsettled. And it was because the primary attachment relationship, and it was clear cut with these two, was being challenged. Okay, next slide, please. Now we're up to the last slide, and what the research says about attachment and overnights. Parents are more likely to separate in the first 3 years than at any other stage. This is why I think we need to have some sort of special approach for infants and children who are under 3, because it's quite common. It's quite challenging to the attachment system between a parent and a child. Interestingly, remembering the stages of attachment that we talked about, especially in the first year, like fairly soon after birth, up until in the first 6 months to a year, there's an increase in separation. I mean, and the reasons are fairly obvious, really. It comes as quite a shock. The demands of an infant. We over romanticize what it's like to our in our peril, I think. It's very challenging and very stressful, and of course, very loving and rewarding, all of those things. That is an awful lot of resentment emerges in that first year, sometimes based on a misunderstanding about the challenge of parenting. Okay, reliable studies that target overnights particularly thin. There's not many of them. The most referenced major longitudinal research is an Australian study. You probably all have heard of it. I know Jen McIntosh quite well. She's the main author of this study. Post-separation parenting arrangements, patterns, and developmental outcomes. It was asked for by the government, so it's pretty solid. It was, when it came out, very controversial and really stirred everybody up. The gender debate was very hot after Jen's research came out. It indicated that infants and toddlers showed more distress behaviors in the context of parent-child interactions and caregiving. Okay, if you had 1 or 2 overnights a week. So independent of all other variables, and it was a very thorough longitudinal study, overnights in and of themselves has the capacity to disrupt the attachment process and to if there is a primary attachment figure, to distress that system. And that didn't include all the other millions of variables that us lucky folk got to deal with: family violence and threat and abandonment and abduction and all the rest of it. Just overnights on themselves can have an effect. My own take on that, the only quibble I have with it, is I am very confident, and I think there's a question that Nicole has developed for us around this, but I'll tackle it a little bit now. Is it, having described the notion of hierarchy, which is it's been around for about 50 years and well researched and well documented, but what hasn't been well researched and what hasn't been documented, and I can only answer from a practice perspective, is it possible to have two people more or less equal as far as bonding and attachment is concerned? I think yes, actually. I think there's some common sense about that, in that take intact families. I don't hate the word intact, but the families where mum and dad are still together, you quite often have a situation where the mother goes out for some relief, goes out with her friends, and the child is quite contentedly with the father. So, without there being distress. So that says to me that it is possible to have two parents who are both more or less at the apex. However, that is very, very uncommon in our context. So with Mackintosh's research, Mackintosh and Smythe, called Post-Separation Parenting Arrangements, Patterns and Developmental Outcomes, my own practice experience appears to me to be quite consistent with Jen Mackintosh's findings, and consistent with the broad attachment research. So I think I'm on reasonably confident ground that what I've told you is evidence-based. And obviously, in family law circumstances, that is really, really important. And by evidence-based, I mean whatever research is available seems to be consistent with my own practice and consistent with the broad sweep of attachment research over what must be now 70 or 80 years. So without more ado, how are we doing timing-wise?
I think we've got time for a couple of questions if you're both happy to answer some.
Sure.
We've had some come through. So the first is, are there cultural differences in how attachment presents?
I wonder if Heather might be able to, or feel able to comment on that.
Yes. Yes, I do enjoy working with culturally and cultural and linguistically diverse families. And I think with the attachment research, it's important to note that a lot of it came from a Western background. And a lot of the attachment measures, like the strange situations, was developed using Western assumptions about children's behavior. But as they started doing more cross-cultural research, I think what they have found is that attachment is a universal human need, but attachment behaviors can look quite different between cultures. So with secure attachment, it does exist in all cultures, and it's found that children do benefit from consistent caregiving, having emotionally available parents, and having someone be responsive to their distress. Yeah, and some interestingly, I think what some studies have found is that there might be different rates of avoidant and ambivalent classifications in attachment styles across cultures. But I think a lot of it, what they have found regarding that fact is that it may partly reflect cultural differences in child rearing practices and how children express their distress rather than fundamental differences in attachment needs themselves. So, for example, in collectivistic cultures, stronger emphasis on interdependence, and children may co-sleep with their parents for longer, and grandparents tend to play a major caregiving role, which is culturally appropriate as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I'm totally with you all the way. In terms of it being an evolutionary process across cultures, the attachment formation process unfolds similarly across all cultures. But the distinctions that Heather made are also true. But it doesn't mean that it's not an evolutionary process that governs mankind in terms of proximity-seeking behaviors for survival purposes. For what it's worth, um, may be interested to know that over many, many years, all the studies have found that round about, this is Western studies, have found about 2/3 of us are securely attached, which leaves a lot of people who might be a little bit ambivalent in their attachment or a little bit avoidant in their attachment, but that doesn't mean insecurity. So it's like on a continuum. Um, I mean, I don't think I probably don't scrub up as a secure human being in attachment terms as far as things like safety are concerned. My internal working model, having worked in a children's hospital, was heavily influenced by trauma and horrible experiences. So me as a parent, I think I was fairly anxiously attached watching my kids in the playground. I'd be the dad who was hovering quite close to the swing, and the others would be having a beer somewhere down the other end of the park. But I was hovering. That's fine, but it's too. I had to be conscious of it, and we'll come to this when we look at circle of security parenting. I knew from circle of security parenting why I was doing what I was doing and could therefore recalibrate. I could go, right, maybe I'll stand back a little bit. I didn't go as far as the boys with the beer, but I stood back a little bit quite consciously so that I could signal, hey, I think you can do this by yourself. I didn't have my child um, adapting their behaviors to my anxiety. Okay, so confession time.
I like that one. And just a little bit of a more practical one. What should I look for when cross-examining an expert who relies on attachment theory?
I think I've thought long and hard about this, and my first answer is pretty much all of the slides that were there today, other than questions about have you done the strange situation test, because they won't have. They won't have, mostly won't have had the training, but certainly ask questions about, well, you say this child is insecurely attached. How do you know that? What do you base that on? Um, and ask more about the observation. Okay. Um, I think the experts need to be challenged a lot more about this sort of stuff, because we're not the important ones, and neither are you folk in this. These little ones are the important ones, and I hope we've demonstrated that getting it a bit better for them is a way to go, because the outcomes can be pretty not very good, you know. So that's I with the strange situation test. Um, I don't think you'll find that many people have done the training. It's ridiculously expensive, and time consuming. Um, it'd be great. I did mine when I was at the family court, and they paid for it. They wouldn't do it now, and I certainly wouldn't do it because I haven't got that kind of money to chuck about. Um, okay.
No. Thank you so much, Paul and Heather, for such a rich and insightful session today. A reminder to everyone listening that the recording will be available through LEAP's Family Law Forum shortly, so do revisit it if you'd like to review anything covered. Our next session, which is part 2, will be on Wednesday, the 1st of July at 4 p.m. And that moves from theory into practice.
Yeah.
So we'll be focusing on attachment-based interventions for children under 4, with particular attention to the Circle of Security parenting program. Paul and Heather will explore how this evidence-based model supports secure attachment and what it means for practitioners engaging with expert evidence in the family law proceedings. Register through the Family Law Forum if you haven't already. Thank you once again, Paul and Heather, and to everyone who joined us today. We look forward to seeing you on the 1st of July.